I have had the privilege of being mentored by Dr. Bobby Conway, the 1 Minute Apologist, for the last few years as I worked as his executive producer. I am now an associate pastor at the Image Church plant where Bobby is the founding pastor. Today, I am re-airing a conversation that we had on the Unapologetic Show where Bobby graciously endorsed this channel and shared his story of doubt. Before we dive in, I want to invite you to join the Dealing With Deconstruction Facebook group, where people just like you are having conversations around questions and topics you are struggling with. The link for that is in the description. Well, several famous people have deconstructed their faith, from Rhett and Link to Good Mythical Morning, to the lead singer from Hawk Nelson, John Steingard, the Gungers, and so many others have said that they have deconstructed their Christian faith. Well, what does that mean? That's what we're going to talk about on this episode of Unapologetic, where we defend truth without compromise. With the 1 Minute Apologist, Dr. Bobby Conway, I'm your host, Tim Hall. Well, Bobby, it's no secret that you went through a significant period of doubt a few years ago. You wrote a book called Doubting Towards Faith that kind of elucidated some of those things that went on that journey. And recently, through your blessing and through God's prompting and through lots of prayer, I ventured out and started my own YouTube channel called Dealing With Deconstruction. And so we want to talk a little bit about what deconstruction is and kind of maybe what's going to happen on the channel. But one of the things that I've been so inspired with has been your story and how you went through some of those things. So maybe you could tell us what started your doubt process? What started you maybe looking at those different pieces of Christianity, which is kind of the definition of deconstructing, is where you're pulling out the different beliefs of Christianity and you're looking at them and you're examining them and you're seeing what needs to fit, what is expendable here, what is essential to the Christian faith. And we've talked a lot about that on this show. So maybe you could take us back to that moment where you really started to scratch your head and say, oh no, I'm starting to have some doubts here.
Yeah, Tim, the word deconstructing is really fitting for what was happening. So like you become a Christian and your faith is constructed. And then I started having it deconstructed by some doubts. And then I had to have it reconstructed in my life again. And so I can remember the first time I got really barraged with doubts is I was at Dallas Theological Seminary. I was taking a class on the life of Christ with Dr. Dwight Pentecost, the late professor who was, internationally famous for some of his end-time writings. And I was studying the Gospels in synoptic fashion. So that is to see Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I was reading those side by side. Those are known as the synoptic Gospels because they're seen together. They're similar. John's a non-synoptic Gospel because it's most non-similar or most unalike Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Yeah. And as I was studying some of the parallel accounts in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, I found myself noticing lots of what would be potential contradictions that it looked like to me. I didn't know what to do with this. I know I was taught that there's no contradictions in the Bible. So it looked like an apparent contradiction to me. And I raised my hand in class and I said, are these the exact words of Jesus in this account, and this account, and this account? Yeah. And Dr. Pentecost said, yes. And I found myself really struggling because I was like, how do you even reconcile if these are the exact words of Jesus? And I read an article called Live Jive or Memorex that was written by Darrell Bach. And it literally unlocked me. Now, I also took Darrell Bach at Dallas Theological Seminary, but he was seeing the way that the synoptic gospels were used in a more free way, and it would help me. So what happened is in the Live Jive or Memorex article, Bach talks about, do we have the exact words, ipsissima verba, or the exact voice, ipsissima vox, of Jesus? When you read these Gospels, are we reading the exact words that Jesus said, or do they capture the voice that he said? And he said they capture the voice that he said. And basically by understanding like Matthew, Mark, Luke, we can't impose 21st century journalistic methods on an ancient day milieu. We need to recognize that they had certain literary freedoms to report the information in the order that they wanted to. And not only that, you think about it. If Jesus spoke in Aramaic, which most people suggest,
right,
we already don't have the exact words
Yeah.
if it's written in Greek.
Yeah.
So for anybody stumbling by that. And so you also think about it like, Stephen's sermon, for example, in Acts chapter 6
and 7.
In
yeah.
7, it actually starts in 7, but yes, his story is there in 6. That's a long sermon. It's the longest sermon in Acts.
Yeah.
Are those the exact words like that he said because he's going to die? So somebody had to be there writing word for word. You're
Right.
writing really, really fast, or you're summarizing the just so of what happened. And so it would be those types of things that would really get at me. And now by understanding that what was acceptable for them and how they reported information in an oral culture, here's what I realized. Because of Bible teachers who meant well in their desire to be faithful, believed that being faithful meant saying the text was saying more than it was saying.
Right.
So when you're looking at Paul's letters, those are the exact words because they're written. But with some of the sermons that you see, or Jesus' prayer in Gethsemane, like, how do we record this? Number one, the disciples were asleep. How do we even know he got it? Well, he would have shown up after his ascension, and then he would have given that. But I think what you have is the exact voice. Now, the words are inspired by the Holy Spirit that the writers put down, but it would be things like this. And I got hammered by intellectual doubts because I think over things that I just don't accept what somebody tells me. I think about it until I feel like it is true.
Right. And that way you and I are similar. We're similar in a lot of ways, Bobby, which is one of the reasons that I love doing ministry with you.
Likewise.
My story is similar in the sense that I wanted to kind of unpack some of those things, but mine really started with just feeling like that I was looking to be accepted. Just in general, I was bullied in school growing up. My closest sibling was 8 years older than I was. I never really had a best friend. And I thought that things would change in the church, that if I, accepted Jesus that I did when I was 12, that when I entered into the walls of the church, that I would find that same acceptance that Jesus seemed to be accepting of people in the New Testament. And I found that not necessarily to be true, unfortunately. Now, granted, there are exceptions. I did, feel lots of love, but I think the people that I tried to connect with the most shunned me or rejected me. And so that raised some significant questions for me around, does God really exist? Is this the Jesus that I know to be true in the scriptures, or do I have to accept the what I see from the leaders of the church as the way that Jesus really is? And that sent me on this journey of really looking into, does God exist? Did Jesus rise from the dead? Can I believe Christianity? And so a lot of what my channel is attempting to do is exactly what you're saying, and what I'm saying is that we're trying to find some of those answers that people are deconstructing. So, what are some of the areas that then you moved on to after that caused you to write your book and that are outlined in some of your book?
Well, it's kind of neat, just as a statement before I answer that. It sounds like your doubts were emotional in nature. Mine were intellectual in nature. They say that most people's doubts are emotional, like it comes through suffering. Yeah. Mine was coming through just analyzing things. And it's neat to be able to see how God took both of our stories and has used it for hopefully his glory, right?
Amen.
And so like you think about what was happening to me, my faith was being constructed. This is the way to understand the synoptics. Then it got deconstructed. And then through Bach's article, it was reconstructed.
Right.
And that helped me. Well, what would happen, Tim, is I did just start questioning everything. World travel, I remember traveling around the world, and I would just find myself thinking, do all these people who really don't know Jesus, are they just going to hell? And then that would send me in to kind of a place of just deep thought on, well, what about those who've never heard the gospel?
Yeah.
And how do I understand that in light of the gospel? And I found myself struggling with suffering and the problem of evil in the world to a certain degree, thinking about what that entails. A lot of my struggles would be with the absurd, what I call the absurd in the Bible. Like anybody who's being intellectually honest reads the Bible, and there's things that just seem absurd. Like we can't relate to. Like go, hey, Abraham, go sacrifice your child, or go walk around Jericho once every day, and then on the seventh day 7 times, and then blow the trumpets. Naaman, go dip in the river 7 times. Isaiah, walk in your undergarments or naked. Ezekiel, lay on your side for 390 days, play with pots and pans, flip over, give me another 40 days. Right. These are odd things. Like we don't always understand. The book of Ezekiel has some very bizarre things. So what happens is I was struggling. How do I live out a faith that I'm struggling relating to? Because there was so much bizarre stuff. Well, so much of what helped me was understanding the Bible on its own terms, stepping into the ancient day milieu, understanding that God's not bound to work with us in the same way that he worked with them, realizing that God was meeting people where they were in the bizarreness of their own culture. So like a lot of the things that seem bizarre to us, well, the culture was bizarre, and God met them in their own bizarreness, and he would straighten them out over time. And so it just helps me to realize that I was being maybe a cultural snob to look at those cultures, but God would work through these doubts. Ending up in my PhD program, studying Nietzsche was bad medicine for a while for me. Studying postmodernism was confusing at first. But what's so great, it's like I found myself panicking as I was going deeper and deeper into the waters of different philosophical thought. But somewhere along the line, I was able to renegotiate my faith stance. It got reconstructed. And by God's grace, I can still have questions and doubt something here and there, but I'm not living in existential angst. I am not experiencing this sense of Weltschmerz, this internal horror. I genuinely feel like a child again, and I'm excited about my faith. And I'm no longer, early on, I think a lot of doubts came with, well, how can I be confident with my Christianity when I haven't studied all these other belief systems? Well, I spent a lot of time studying other belief systems, and I believe that the resurrection of Jesus Christ is the best thing going.
Amen. I do have a video on my channel that responds to a kind of a well-known pastor of a progressive church. His name is Reverend Brandon Robertson. And one of the things that he said in the video that I responded to was how he felt like that conservatives shunned the ability to doubt, that they didn't like doubt, they didn't like questions at all. And I was saying that my experience was different than that. I mean, when I started to have questions, I had a mentor pastor friend of mine that would meet with me every single Friday where I would bring him my questions and we would discuss them and talk about them, or I would be listening to debates and kind of bring him the other side of the argument, and he would, graciously walk through that with me. I'm thankful for mentors like you that have experienced doubt and say, yeah, when we have questions. You and I just had a recent story where someone that's going to Image Church right now, we're the pastors of Image Church, kind of said, man, I really appreciate that you hit things just head on, that you're not willing to kind of circumnavigate maybe the more difficult parts of the Bible. So you and I haven't necessarily experienced that culture of don't ask questions, you're not allowed to doubt. What would be some advice for maybe people that have felt that have got that, clamped down on them? No, you can't ask questions. No, you're not allowed to doubt. No, you have to just accept this without kind of thinking about it at all. What would be your advice to that person?
Yeah, isn't that sad? I mean, there are certain, faith contexts where people are told, don't ever question your faith.
Yeah.
Well, that sounds like a Muslim who just unquestionably doesn't ask questions about, the nature of Allah. It just assumes that this is right.
Right.
I think that we are to ask questions, and we see in the Bible that they freely ask questions. In the book of Habakkuk, we see doubt. Abraham struggled with doubt. Thomas struggled with doubt. Peter struggled with doubt. I mean, look, to be human is to doubt. Doubt is not a Christian problem. It's a human problem.
Right.
In the absentee of certainty, there's always going to be room for doubt. The question is, which worldview best closes the doubt gap?
Yeah.
And I think that we have to be able to recognize that even in the book of Jude, it says, be merciful to those who doubt.
Yeah.
Jesus can handle our doubts. In fact, I wrote a chapter in my book, Doubting Toward Faith, entitled that. John the Baptist, I mean, think about it. He baptized Jesus. He was the cousin of Jesus.
Yeah.
He said, behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. Yet when he was on death row and his head was about to be on the chopping block, he had his own doubts.
He sure did.
And you think about that. It's easy to be bold when you're free in the public, right? You'd think. But when your head's about to be on a chopping block, you want to know for sure if this is worth dying for. He sends his disciples off with his doubts. Now, you can imagine the disciples thinking, excuse me, Mr. John, I thought that you told us he was the Messiah. I did, but I just want to make sure now.
Right.
Okay. So they go. And so it tells you, number one, that he was a vulnerable leader because he told his disciples his doubts. And so the doubts are taken to Jesus. Jesus doesn't panic. He doesn't freak out. He says, go tell John that the deaf hear, the blind see, the lame, that they walk. And I love it. So Jesus was operating like a good evidentialist. He offers some good apologetics. And then he tells the crowd, what did you go out into the open to hear? A reed blown and tossed by the wind?
Right.
Because he knew that people could be thinking, oh, John's doubting. He said, no, I tell you the truth. No one's been born greater of woman than John. Jesus paid his greatest compliment to a human in his ministry on the heels of that person's doubts.
Amen.
And that's because Jesus can discern between skeptical and sincere doubt, between authentic and antagonistic doubt. So what would I say to those who are doubting, to those who feel like their faith is being deconstructive? Well, take your doubts to Jesus. Authentically pray like the psalmist. He knows what's going on there. Find a culture whereby you can hopefully open up and be real. Jesus can handle your doubts. The church might not be able to.
Right.
But look for some people who are open. There is a group called Room for Doubt. That's a website. Go check that out.
Yeah.
And jump in there on the Room for Doubt and just start dialoguing.
Yeah. No, I think that's super great advice. I mean, one of the things that, again, my channel is trying to do is trying to create that space for people to ask those questions and to doubt. And I know that it can be lonely. So I'm not sure in your experience of doubt, if you felt like, man, I just don't know where I can go with some of these questions or who I can talk to because, people will, kind of scratch their head and say, Bobby, I have no idea some of the answers, some of the questions that you have. But I know that it can be lonely. And I think that's one of the things that I'm seeking to do on my channels to create a space for that. We have a Facebook group called Dealing With Deconstruction where people can ask questions, people can dialogue, or they can just, be heard in some of that. So I think that's really important for people to just kind of, understand that you can ask questions, you can be known in that sense, and you can walk with others kind of through your deconstructing process.
That's a good point, by the way, Tim, because it was very lonely for me. I was fortunate. The leadership team I was open with, and they didn't freak out because I think from the beginning we set that culture up. Yeah. I knew in my heart, by the way, like I said, I hate these doubts. My brain is producing questions faster than I can track down the answer to them. And so I was preaching by faith, like, God, help me. I mean, I just have to say something like, I don't understand this all. I hate that I'm being racked with these doubts. Just take my sermon today and bless it. I mean well. I'm overcome.
Yeah.
And I think that the leaders understood that was my spirit. I knew that if I came to a spot and rejected it, that I'd have to have the integrity to step down. But thankfully, God brought me through it. Now, all that to say is it was lonely, though, because as a pastor and as an apologist, I knew I was thinking at levels that your everyday layperson wasn't.
Yeah.
And so I was pastoring and working on this PhD, and I didn't have a lot of scholars around me that I could unload on. Thankfully, I could call someone like a Mike Lacona, and he was very helpful. Gary Habermas, who's written on doubt, was very helpful to me.
Yeah.
So I did have some scholars that I could reach out to that I'm very thankful for. But that's the thing. When you're a pastor and you're entrenched in like academic work, you have to be careful that you don't go and unload all of your doubts on your congregation, because they're not necessarily trained with the skills to even think their way out of some of this stuff yet. Yeah. And so it's not that they couldn't be trained in that, but you need to show some wisdom. And I think at times I would have lacked that in my life. Where I really saw it was with my wife. She didn't know how to help me, because I was just advancing so much intellectually through the years. I was in this crisis. I mean, literally, I entertained suicidal thoughts.
Yeah.
The pressure was overwhelming. I thought I was going to be an apostate. I just did not know how I was going to pull through this. I felt like I was hanging by a string. And Heather would just struggle. I'd try to connect with her and say, "Oh my goodness, I'm thinking about this. I'm thinking about this." And then I was bogging her down. And she just had this beautiful, simplistic faith. And I'm like, "Oh my goodness, I'm crushing her."
Yeah.
And it was really hard for my family to watch. It was like looking at somebody who was just dying on the inside.
Yeah. And those people that are in that spot are the people that I'm, continuing to look to walk with. Sometimes we need to be ready to give an answer, but sometimes we need to listen. And I know that is a thing that I've got from you and try to adopt it from you, that we just want to be able to listen and try to provide space for people to just ask questions and dialogue. And maybe the answers that we give aren't going to be satisfying or aren't going to convince them. But the fact that they're kind of going through this process, we want to just walk with them.
So where can people go to check out your channel?
Yeah. So you can go to youtube.com and you can just search Dealing with Deconstruction. I'll go ahead and put a link to that in the description. So you can, find the channel right from the description of this podcast. If you're listening to us on the radio, you can do a search for Dealing with Deconstruction on YouTube and find us there.
See, what I love about you, Tim, is you're a lay person, but you're well studied. And I just want our audience to know that I really appreciate that about Tim. He really models well what a Christian should be. And go check out that channel, because what you're looking at is another fellow layperson.
Yeah.
And so if he seems articulate on the show and well informed, he is, but he didn't go into a professional ministry career. He's a layperson that loves this stuff, and God's using him greatly.
I do want to get your opinion on maybe some of the miscommunication that happens that causes some of these, deconstruction processes. But I do want to mention quickly before we talk about that, I did have a chance to interview Mike Lacona on the show. I did have a chance to do a response video with Chris Date to someone that wrote a book called Raising Hell. She's a universalist, so it's interesting to have Chris Date, who's an annihilationist, on to respond to a universalist. So again, that's not something that we see a lot. I've had the chance to interview Elisa Childers on purity culture. She was, in that zone when she was with Zoe Girl, and so it's just a good chance to kind of unpack some of those things with her. And I have the opportunity to talk to John Steingard, who I mentioned at the beginning of this show, who is the former lead singer of Hawk Nelson. Yep. He has his own channel. He has since deconstructed his faith and become an atheist. But he talked a lot about one of the reasons that he abandoned his faith was the problem of evil. And so I just thought it was interesting that you had mentioned that you traveled around and you saw some of the suffering, and that's some of John's story too. So I do want you to talk a little bit about maybe this miscommunication that seems to be happening here in our few remaining minutes between, Christian fundamentalism and maybe mainline evangelicalism and whatnot.
Yeah, well, I think we can hold to our convictions, and that's fine. But we can hold to them and still be friendly. Right. We can hold to them and still be loving. And I think that what happens sometimes is you have people who are just being, especially on social media, bombastic. They would be better off just canceling all their social media platforms because they're doing more harm to Christianity by their ugly tones, and they think that they're just doing God a service through defending the truth. Right. Well, if you're defending the truth, but you're doing it in a way that's offensive, in the sense that you're coming across arrogant, prideful, condemning, self-righteous, then go cancel your platforms and get your heart cleaned up before God and get a humble posture and then come back. That's what I would suggest, because we need to learn how to listen to each other, validate each other, not cancel each other. And so those who just want to go on and blast other people, go get some time in the presence of the Lord, ask for your heart to be softened, and then when you're ready to come and be a listener and realize that you can still love people that you disagree with, and you can still be kind to people who are adamantly and vehemently against Christianity, I think that that's what we need. I mean, I want to be in a pool of influencers that don't always agree with one another, but they can do it in a way that you go, wow, that person's courteous. Yeah. That person is gracious. I think that would do a lot to heal some pain that's going on in the kingdom.
Well, I think that is exactly right. So I do want to say at the end of this show here that, Bobby, I appreciate your mentorship. I appreciate your scholarship and going through all of your material and being able to ask you questions on this show and look at the back back catalog of all of the 1,000+ videos that we have done, that has really spurred me on to feel like that I do have the ability to answer some of these questions and to walk with people that are deconstructing in this way. And I do give an homage at the end of every single one of my episodes to you and invite people to doubt towards faith. Yeah. And I think that's really important, that one of the things that we, as we're going through that process and as we're taking apart pieces of Christianity, that we're trusting that God is leading us in that. And I think that's so important. So, Bobby, thank you so much for all of your friendship and your mentorship. I really appreciate that.
Thank you, bud.
Well, that takes us to the end of this episode of Unapologetic, and I will end this episode like I do on mine. If you are deconstructing your faith, we want to invite you to doubt towards faith. We'll see you next time on the Unapologetic Show.